John Grierson described documentary as a window to the real in the creative treatment of actuality, and he should know as the person who came up with the term documentary in the 1920s. Grierson was a Scottish filmmaker known as the father of documentary and was quoted saying he looks on cinema as a pulpit and uses it as a tool for propaganda. Above all else, Grierson valued truth and authenticity. His work, First Principles of Documentary, shaped the definition of documentary as he outlined effective ways to portray truth, including raw location shooting and the filming of real people doing real things, highlighting a deeper reality of the everyday. Grierson, knowing his definition was loose, clarified his stance in noting the difference between documentary and lower representations of reality, including travelogues, newsreels, and educational films. Overall, Grierson saw documentary as a way to cause social reform based on exposure to certain representations of certain realities. However, just because a film is authentic, that doesn't mean that the treatment of that authenticity can't reach to meet a certain aesthetic. In fact, Grierson was quite focused on the poetic aspects of documentary, especially the intersection between poetic experimentation, narrative storytelling, and rhetorical oratory. His own work, including the film Night Mail, which he narrated, is just as visually appealing as it is educational. This film in particular shaped the structure of documentary and received quite a bit of praise. This film's production style was simple, handheld, with minimal editing and transitional sound, which some critics of realist cinema would argue against, but that's a whole different topic.
This is the night mail crossing the border, bringing the check and the postal order, letters for the rich, letters for the poor, the shop at the corner and the girl next door, pulling up, he took a steady climb, the gradient's against her, but she's on time.
Bill Nichols, in his text Introduction to Documentary, later elaborated on 6 types of documentary: poetic, expository, participatory, reflexive, observational, and performative. We probably don't have time to talk about what each of those mean, but just know that there are many different types of documentaries. Grierson was also focused on political and social activism, which was a natural transition from the political confusion at his time with rhetorical shifts between European avant-garde filmmakers and Soviet filmmakers. He sought to empower personal stories as they relate to government responsibility and saw film as a tool for education. Grierson valued democracy and the individual's right to engage with their government, which makes sense that his view on filmmaking emphasizes the individual.
Education is the master medium of all media. And of course, when it takes over, as I hope it will take over, because I want the real professional communicators to be the teachers and the givers of law and the givers, the people who can address the people properly.
So, how does Grierson's definition shape the practices of documentary production? Grierson made several statements about how one should go about the treatment of reality, including using original actors, raw footage, minimal directorial intervention, and not using scripts. In the 1995 film Anything Can Happen, director Marcel Lazinski shows his 6-year-old son Tomek discussing the intricacies of life, death, marriage, wealth, war, and religion with his elderly neighbors, sharing and comparing life experiences. Bozana Janik wrote about the film that it captures the sadness of passing and the strength of life, but more than that, it captures a man growing inside a child. Tomek engages in deep conversations, asking simple yet poignant questions his adult neighbors have difficulty answering. This film is shot with a sort of fly-on-the-wall approach with many long shots letting the viewer sit on the image. Grierson's definition of documentary can be applied to realist cinema generally, and especially the ideals of French film critic André Bazin. Bazin had a similar devotion to the real and a fascination with what is the long take, resting on a single image without the use of cuts. His idea was, in realist cinema, edits must have a purpose, and they must be used sparingly. Grierson, although he didn't condemn the use of montage like Bazin did, would likely have a similar view on the power of the long take. Anything Can Happen does an excellent job of using the long take, the last scene in particular. Bazin favored cuts in what is called parallel juxtaposition, basically calling attention to opposing images, which is exactly the way in which Lazinski approaches his editing decisions. The cuts flow just as naturally as the conversations do. Tomek is shown riding through the park on a scooter, chasing butterflies, then cut to a scene of him philosophizing about the universe. Then there's this scene which I love where Tomek is feeding birds, followed by an old man on a bench feeding birds. This use of juxtaposition and cutting reveals a higher theme of the film. the marriage of curiosity, innocence, intuition, the way Tomek asks the most basic and yet the most complicated questions. This is definitely an editing approach Lisinski has used in other films, like his film 89mm to Europe, which chronicles the journey of a train from Paris to Moscow. This film is made of several long takes with minimal editing and handheld style. Grierson valued authenticity, and Anything Can Happen certainly highlights authenticity. The decision to shoot with a long lens peering from in between trees, seemingly hidden, is a quality example of Grierson's window to the real approach. The camera is handheld, the editing is non-flashy and direct. Grierson would likely approve of the film's political commentary. Watching Tomek learn about the Polish history and the cause behind wars is a beautiful way to educate the audience about the perception of war. This film serves a purpose, and that purpose is to illuminate social identity, history, and culture, whether universal or specifically Polish, from an existential and political view. The way I see it, it's about starting conversations, which Grierson was a big fan of. In all honesty, I struggle to think of how Grierson would not approve of this film. Although it was made in the 1990s, the way it's filmed is reminiscent of early documentary work like Nanook of the North, or even the film Grierson himself watched that led him to coin the term documentary, Robert Flaherty's Moana. Simple, poetic, following the journey of one authentic subject, a window to the real. Anything Can Happen is existential, sentimental, curious, poetic, political, and above all, it reflects a profound verisimilitude. As far as how I could see this documentary influencing my own work, I've definitely seen a lot of value in the long take. Usually I take more of a montage approach to filmmaking, my apologies to Andre Bazin, but I do like the effect of the long take in several of the films I've seen, and it does feel very real. Now, circling back to John Grierson, is Grierson's definition still useful? I would say yes, absolutely. Documentary has changed, that is definitely true. But above all, documentary is still about truth, authenticity. Grierson's separation of types, and Nichols for that matter, may actually be more useful today as we have so much media and so many different ways of getting information. In regards to Anything Can Happen, it definitely holds up to the standards of Grierson's definition, as would films like Don't Look Back, which chronicles Bob Dylan's 1965 tour and is known for its use of the long take. However, for something like Uwe Butler's Shed at Dulwich, Grierson might take some issue. This piece features a Vice journalist creating a fake restaurant that makes it to #1 recommended and reviewed spot in London. It's utterly fascinating, and it's gotten a ton of praise. But how would Grierson feel about this directorial intervention? It's real, it features real people doing real things, which is most of what Grierson thought documentaries should be, but is an interactive documentary still a window to the real, or a disruption of the real?
That made me see TripAdvisor as like a false reality that everyone took completely seriously. Over the years I just thought the only bit of TripAdvisor that is unfakeable is a restaurant itself. And one day I thought, oh, maybe it is actually fakeable.
If it's the latter, does that then make it not documentary? I think Grierson would struggle with this. For the record, I would still say that it is documentary, it's just a different type. To take the Nichols approach, probably a reflexive film which shows the audience the sort of man behind the curtain. On the other hand, Nichols would likely label a film like Anything Can Happen as poetic, so both documentaries, each very different. I'm also not sure how Grierson would feel about a film like Montage of Heck, which is the Kurt Cobain biography and features a lot of flashy editing and a lot of animation. At least Bazin, when he talked about editing, said that it was insulting to the viewer to use a lot of really clear edits because it was open to interpretation from the audience, or at least it was supposed to be. I'm not sure exactly if that was the message behind Grierson's favoring of the long take, but it'd be interesting to explore. Overall, Grierson valued political and social consciousness, simple editing, and above all, a sense of the real. There will be some documentaries challenging that definition, and there will be some meeting it pretty directly, like Anything Can Happen. But filmmaking is a changing art, and it evolves with its audience. Above everything, Grierson valued authenticity, and he viewed documentary as a creative treatment of reality and a tool for education and political activism. He essentially defined the foundation of documentary filmmaking.